Let's get to the story of the day. Following the birth of my youngest child, I required a hysterectomy to stop the life-threatening menstrual bleeding I'd been having for years. As far as I know, the procedure went well. I awoke in the recovery area, slightly disoriented, and was transferred to my shared room to recuperate. Nothing extraordinary happened in terms of medicine save my complete lack of discomfort, which surprised my nurses. They insisted on heavy pain medicine, which I refused because I didn't want to be dragged back into semi-consciousness. Otherwise, I was a routine case, and the nurses quickly discharged me. However, when the anesthetic fog lifted, a horrible sensation overtook me. Not physical pain, but extremely agonizing awareness. I was conscious that I'd just been forced back into this body by someone I couldn't refuse. I knew I had resisted returning to my body because of its density, frailty, slowness, heaviness, and inevitable degradation towards a horrible end. I knew for certain, in a difficult-to-explain sense, that I had left my body and returned to my actual self. It was a fantastic experience. I recognized myself as light. I sensed my immense power, broad comprehension, and connection to all that is. Not power in the sense of power over anything, but the intrinsic ability to go across time and space, to learn about everything, to create, flow, and be. I was enormous. I was unequivocal. I was overjoyed. I was madly in love. I was a part of the total, a part of my soul group. On an energetic level, being compelled to re-enter my dark, heavy, little physical body was excruciatingly painful. The sense of bleak isolation from the real world, from anyone I'd just been with, was excruciatingly painful. I was acutely aware of the body's progressive degradation, as I'd never been before, because of its incapacity to reach the freedom of mind and connection that I had just experienced. I felt sad, heavy, and even angry, and it appeared that my life would be unable to contain the weight of my emotions. I wished to return home. I desired to be my true self, and above all, I didn't want to have to stay in this horrible physical meat body and feel what it felt like all the way through, what I assumed would be a lengthy, agonizing death. And yet, in a way I'd never known before, I realized that suffering and degradation were the only paths out. There was no other way out. It was like being locked into your seat on a giant roller coaster, and the car starts to move ahead, and you know there's no way out except to ride it. But it was far more thrilling than any roller coaster would possibly be. This was not what I was looking for. I felt completely powerless over what was happening to me. I felt nothing but anguish for the rest of the day. Not actual suffering, but the melancholy was almost bodily in its grip. When my husband came to visit, I couldn't put it into words how I felt. He didn't get it. I can't say I blame him. I didn't get it either. It wasn't that I hadn't heard of NDEs. In fact, when I was pregnant a few years ago, I was inspired to visit the library in the little town where my midwife practiced and was directed to a shelf containing numerous books on NDEs. That sent me on a journey to learn everything I could about these encounters. What I read had a little but significant impact on my spiritual life. Much of what I read seemed so familiar, and it gave me a sense of self-acceptance and calm that I'd never known before. A few days before my operation, I prayed, somewhat humbly, for permission to have my own NDE if it was in my best interests and the best interests of my family. I wasn't expecting anything spectacular. I didn't want my family or doctor to go through the ordeal of believing I had died. I only wanted to get back to home. I could almost remember when I read about other people's experiences on the other side. Something in me really missed it. My life had been filled with trauma up to that point, and I was completely drained. The unconditional love they spoke of felt so familiar to me, despite the fact that nothing in my past had prepared me to identify it. Without expecting it, I prayed that God would work out a way for me to experience it for myself, to bring that experience into my life as a type of life preserver, to buoy me up when things were simply so hard and stressful. As I lay in my hospital bed that evening after surgery, one thought occurred to me with painful irony. Be cautious what you pray for. I had no doubt that I'd been somewhere spectacular after leaving the physical world. I'm not sure how I knew, but I knew I'd gone at least halfway home before being forced or convinced to re-enter my body. And yet, I had no recall of the experience. What I was experiencing were withdrawal symptoms. Ironic cosmic justice, if you will. In an attempt to release some of the sorrow that threatened to overwhelm and drag me down, I began a drawing, a picture of my dual consciousness of my spiritual self, majestic and joyful, taking flight from the cold flesh of my physical self. The nurses who came in to take vitals were surprised, but didn't appear to want to know what it meant. And I was too tired to explain why I was drawing a naked corpse-like guy with a blazing, powerful-looking phantasm of light happily pouring out of his chest. I poured my heart and soul into that drawing. Art has always been my method of connecting with wholeness and joy, but nothing could take away the despair I was experiencing. After midnight, the word semi-quiet was disrupted by a sobbing, groaning voice that made its way down the hall towards the room I was in. An old woman was brought in by a team of nurses, her hands flapping as she shouted out in pain that no one cared about her. Her daughter assisted the nurses in settling her mother into her bed and murmured nice, soothing words to her mother. I lay there listening to the commotion. She sobbed and made a disturbing animal-like moan every now and again. The nurses informed her daughter that if she couldn't be calmed down, they would have to confine her. The daughter claimed that it was unnecessary and would not help, making it clear that her mother would receive dignified care. She kept answering and re-answering the same questions for her befuddled mother, who didn't appear to know her and kept asking for her daughter, who would look after her. The elderly woman eventually appeared to have exhausted herself and dropped into a shallow, interrupted slumber. I was grateful for her daughter's patience with her. In the midst of my own terrible misery and hopelessness, it was a huge comfort. As noon came the next day, the nurses advised the daughter to go home for a few hours of much-needed rest. Her mother had finally fallen asleep. Her mother awoke and began to sob just 30 minutes after she unwillingly left the hospital. She sobbed in dread and despair because her daughter had abandoned her there. "She doesn't love me," she sobbed. The overworked nurses spoke to her loudly and clearly, painstakingly enunciating as they had probably been taught to do with the elderly and bewildered. They advised her she needed to calm down. They warned her that if she didn't calm down, they would have to restrain her. She became more upset and louder as they talked. I couldn't take her pain on top of my own. The notion of her daughter returning and discovering her beloved mother bound and out of her mind was awful. That's when the second half of my NDE started. "This is the point of it all," a silent voice in my head said emphatically. My knowledge filled and expanded beyond the boundaries of my dismal sense of confinement when the voice said this. I realized that we are all trapped in these bodies, unable to avoid the full experience of physical mortality, as if an individual canoes on a river of difficult, painful, terrifying experiences, and the only thing that makes any of it worthwhile are the moments when we can reach from our own boat and, for just a moment, ease someone else's loneliness and suffering in theirs, to connect in kindness and love as our boats collide in life's tide. My entire emotional state was revolutionized, and I was overcome with a newfound love and bravery to reach out. My usual restraint and timidity vanished. Each person in the hospital became totally precious and beautiful to me. I could see them as the graceful beings they were, rather than the little, shattered creatures they felt they were. I could see what people truly needed, and I had the heart and spirit to provide it. I got out of bed, wrapped a shawl around my shoulders, and sat down next to the elderly lady. I took her hand in mine and spoke softly to her, attempting to channel her daughter's way of being with her. I informed her that her daughter adored her. She battled with me about it at first. Something prompted me to remind her of how she used to force her daughter to take naps when she was a child, and to explain that her daughter had stayed up all night and was so weary that she was merely taking a nap and would soon be back with her. I reminded her how much she loved her baby, how well she'd cared for her, and how badly her kid needed sleep right now. As I sat and held her hand, warm in my own, she quieted and became comfortable, ultimately dozing off. That felt like a miracle to me, but inside me was a wordless miracle of metamorphosis taking place. Within me, a fountain of delight seemed to burst forth. The revelatory part was that I still felt trapped, sad, and cut off from my true self and home. But the power to soothe another trapped, embodied soul brought grace to my state, making it meaningful and curiously beautiful, as painful as it still was. Joy and agony coexist in the same body. I felt like I'd discovered the purpose of life. It's only now, some 18 years later, that I've discovered that many of the changes and disruptions in my life since then are exactly the same as the after effects of NDEs. I'm not sure if what I had done was an NDE, but I do know that it radically impacted the landscape of my life, transforming my spirituality, my relationships with myself and my family, and my ambitions, desires, and way of being. It's been really beneficial to read about the recognized after effects of NDEs in order to put some of the more perplexing changes I've noticed in myself into context.